There is a photograph, black and white grainy, taken on a cold December morning on the sand dunes of North Carolina. In it you can see a fragile machine, wood and canvas and wire, lifted just a few feet off the ground. Beside it a man is running, reaching out as if to steady something he can barely believe is real. And in that machine, lying flat on his stomach, another man is flying, not soaring, not gliding gracefully into history. Just flying, barely, desperately, magnificently, for 12 seconds over 120 feet of freezing wind and hard earth. 12 seconds. That is all it took to split human history into two halves, the world before flight and the world after it. The men in that photograph were not generals. They were not kings or presidents or celebrated scientists with universities behind their names. They were bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio. They had no college degrees, no government funding, no famous backers writing them fat checks from leather armchairs. They had a workshop, a set of tools, two brilliant minds, and an obsession so complete, so total, so consuming that it swallowed years of their lives whole and gave back something the world had never seen before. They were Orville Wright and Wilbur Wright, and they did what every expert said could not be done. This is their story, and it begins not with sand and wind and engines, but with a toy. In the summer of 1878, a man named Milton Wright came home with something for his boys. Milton was a bishop in the Church of the United Brethren, a quiet and serious man who believed deeply in education and in the power of curiosity. He had 4 children at the time: Ruchlin, Lauren, Wilbur, and little Orville, who was barely 7 years old. On this particular evening, Milton held something behind his back, and when he let it go, it flew. It was a small helicopter toy, a simple thing made of cork and bamboo and paper, powered by a twisted rubber band. It spun upward, hovered for a moment, and then fell to the floor. The boys were transfixed. Wilbur, who was 11, and Orville, who was 7, stared at the ceiling where it had risen as if the air itself had suddenly become interesting. They picked it up, studied it, turned it over in their hands, and almost immediately began trying to build a bigger one. When the bigger one didn't work as well as the smaller one, they didn't understand why. They filed that question away. Children do that sometimes. They ask a question and they never really stop asking it, even when they grow up, even when the world tells them to move on to more practical concerns. Wilbur and Orville never stopped asking why the bigger toy didn't fly as well. And that question, nursed over decades, would eventually change everything. The Wright family was an unusual one in the best possible way. Milton Wright was not a wealthy man, but he was an intellectually generous father. He encouraged his children to read, to argue, to investigate, to question. The family home in Dayton was filled with books, an enormous personal library for the time and the place, and the children were allowed and actively encouraged to dig through it, to read anything they liked, to follow their curiosity wherever it led. Susan Wright, their mother, was in many ways even more remarkable than their father. She had a gift for mechanics, a rare and striking thing in a woman of her era, and she built things with her hands: sleds, household gadgets, small contraptions that solved domestic problems with elegant simplicity. Her children inherited her hands. They inherited her instinct for making things work. Wilbur was born in 1867 near Millville, Indiana. He was, by all accounts, a remarkable young man, intensely intelligent, deeply focused, capable of a kind of sustained concentration that unnerved people who didn't know him well. He read voraciously. He had a sharp, probing mind and a talent for getting to the heart of complex problems with startling directness. His teachers expected great things from him. He was being prepared in those early years for college, for a career perhaps in academia or in the church like his father. And then, in the winter of 1885 and 1886, something happened that changed the trajectory of his life. During a game of ice hockey on a frozen pond, a young man swung his bat wildly and struck Wilbur in the face. The blow knocked out several of his teeth and caused injuries that, while not permanently disfiguring, seemed to trigger a cascade of physical and psychological problems. Wilbur retreated. The college plans dissolved. He spent years at home, reading, caring for his mother Susan, who was herself ill with tuberculosis, and slowly, quietly falling into a kind of intellectual hibernation from which he would eventually emerge with his focus narrowed to a single burning point. Orville was born in 1871, 4 years younger than his brother. Where Wilbur was intense and inward, Orville was energetic, playful, inventive in a quick and sparkling way. He was the kind of boy who could not sit still in a classroom, but who could spend 12 uninterrupted hours building something in a workshop without noticing the time pass. He dropped out of high school before finishing his final year, not from laziness but from restlessness. The formal classroom could not hold him. He was already printing his own newspaper at the age of 17. having built, with characteristic ingenuity, his own printing press from a damaged buggy and assorted scrap materials. He had his mother's hands and his father's love of ideas, and he was burning with energy that needed somewhere to go. In 1892, the brothers opened a bicycle shop. This was not an idle choice. The 1890s were the age of the bicycle. The safety bicycle, as it was called, had just transformed personal transportation. And in cities across America, people were desperate for good machines, well-maintained, properly fitted, expertly repaired. The Wright Cycle Company became first a repair shop, then a retailer, and eventually a manufacturer of custom bicycles. The brothers were good at it. They were precise, careful, innovative. They understood machines. They understood that machines had logic, that mechanical problems had solutions if you were patient enough and smart enough and willing to take the thing apart and look at it long and hard enough. The bicycle shop made them a modest living. It also, without their quite realizing it, gave them a framework for thinking about the problem of flight. Because by the mid-1890s, flight was on their minds. It had never entirely left, not since that toy helicopter in 1878, but now it was becoming a genuine, organized, consuming interest. The news from Europe and from the American frontier of engineering was exciting and terrible in equal measure. Men were trying to fly. Men were dying trying to fly. Otto Lilienthal, a German engineer of great talent and great courage, had been making gliding flights for years, hundreds of them, carefully documented, scientifically rigorous. He was the most serious student of flight in the world. In 1896, he died when his glider stalled and plunged him to the earth. Wilbur read about Lilienthal's death and felt something shift inside him. If a man that skilled, that careful, that knowledgeable could die chasing flight, then either the problem was impossible or it was harder than anyone had yet truly understood. Wilbur decided it was the latter. He decided someone needed to understand it more completely. He decided that someone might as well be him. He began reading everything he could find. He wrote to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington in 1899, asking for whatever literature they had on the subject of flight. The Smithsonian sent him pamphlets and suggested titles, and Wilbur read them all. He read about Lilienthal and about Samuel Langley, the secretary of the Smithsonian himself, who was also working on flying machines with significant government backing. He read about Octave Chanute, a respected Chicago engineer who had become something of the elder statesman of aviation, collecting and synthesizing the work of everyone who was trying to solve the problem of flight. Wilbur absorbed it all. And then, with the systematic clarity that was his great gift, he began to identify the central problem that everyone else seemed to be either missing or undervaluing. Everyone, he noticed, was spending enormous energy on propulsion, on how to get a flying machine moving fast enough to lift off. And they were spending a great deal of time on lift, on wing shapes that could generate enough upward force. But almost nobody was seriously addressing the third problem, the problem that had killed Lilienthal and that would kill others, the problem of control. What good was a machine that could lift into the air if the pilot had no way to manage it once it was there? The air was not smooth. Air was alive with invisible turbulence, shifting in 3 dimensions simultaneously. A machine in flight was not like a carriage on a road. It could pitch nose up, nose down, it could yaw, swing left, swing right, and it could roll tip sideways, one wing rising while the other fell. To fly safely, to fly controllably, a pilot needed to manage all 3 of these movements at once with precision, with confidence, in real time. Nobody had solved this. Wilbur decided this was the key: control first. Everything else second. And then he had an idea, a beautiful, simple, almost absurdly elegant idea. He was standing in the bicycle shop one afternoon, absently handling a long cardboard box, the kind that inner tubes came in, when he noticed something. He twisted the box. One end twisted one way, the other end twisted the other way, and the top surface on one side raised while the top surface on the other lowered. He stared at this for a long moment. Then he began to think about wings. If you could twist the wings of a flying machine, if you could warp them, bend them slightly, changing the angle of one wingtip relative to the other, you could control the rolling motion of the aircraft. You could make it bank into turn deliberately, rather than having it roll and tip at the mercy of the wind. Wing warping. He had invented the concept of lateral control independently from first principles, holding a cardboard inner tube box in a bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio. He brought Orville in. From this point forward, the project belonged to both of them equally, though the historical record sometimes obscures this by focusing too heavily on Wilbur's initial theoretical insights. Orville brought something essential to the partnership: a quicker mechanical intuition, a more playful experimental instinct, a willingness to try things and see what happened where Wilbur preferred to reason from theory. Together, they were extraordinary. Together, they were probably something close to unstoppable. They built a kite in 1899. Not a toy kite, a carefully constructed biplane kite with a 5-foot wingspan designed to test the wing warping idea. They flew it in a field outside Dayton. It worked. The warp hubble wings responded to control inputs. The kite banked and turned as commanded. The principle was sound. They were not yet building a flying machine. They were building a research program, step by methodical step, the way good engineers build things, the way men who mean to succeed build things. They needed to test with a pilot. For that, they needed a place with steady winds and soft landing surfaces. Wilbur wrote to Octave Chanute, who had become something of a mentor and correspondent, and Chanute suggested they contact the United States Weather Bureau for data on wind conditions at various locations. The Weather Bureau's data pointed to several promising sites, and after further correspondence, the brothers chose Kitty Hawk, a small settlement on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. The Outer Banks were a thin strip of barrier islands and sand dunes hugging the coast of North Carolina, separated from the mainland by Albemarle Sound. Kill Devil Hills, just south of Kitty Hawk proper, was dominated by a series of large sand dunes. Big Kill Devil Hill was almost 100 feet high, and the steady Atlantic winds that came in off the ocean were nearly perfect for their purposes. The sand was soft. The dunes provided a natural slope for gliding. The isolation was both a practical advantage, no crowds, no distractions, and, perhaps unconsciously, a kind of protection for an experiment that the brothers were not yet willing to share with the world. They arrived at Kitty Hawk for the first time in the fall of 1900. Wilbur came first, and his letters home to his father and to Orville are extraordinary documents, precise, observational, almost deadpan in their matter-of-fact descriptions of a strange, wild, beautiful place. The Outer Banks in 1900 were genuinely remote. There was no railroad, there were no hotels. The locals were fishermen and lifeguards, hardy people who lived in low wooden houses against the wind and made what living they could from the sea. Wilbur found them hospitable and practical, the kind of people who appreciated competence and didn't ask too many questions. He camped in a tent on the sand and waited for Orville, who arrived soon after with their glider in pieces. The 1900 glider was a biplane with a 17-foot wingspan. They flew at first as a kite, unmanned, testing the control surfaces, watching how it responded to wind, how the wing warping system worked in actual flight conditions. When they flew it with a pilot, both brothers took turns as they would throughout the testing program, refusing to allow one to take all the risk. It glided beautifully. They were thrilled and disappointed in roughly equal measure. The wing warping worked. The glider was manageable, but it generated far less lift than Lilienthal's published data suggested it should. The numbers didn't add up. The machine should have been flying better than it was. Something was wrong with the existing data. They went back to Dayton. They thought about it through the winter. In 1901, they returned to Kill Devil Hills with a larger glider, the biggest man-carrying glider anyone had yet built, with a 22-foot wingspan. It should have performed brilliantly. It didn't. It was worse than the 1900 machine in several important respects. The wing warping sometimes produced strange, counterintuitive results. When the pilot tried to raise a dropping wing, sometimes the wing dropped further instead. This was deeply alarming. It was the kind of thing that had killed people. And still the lift was wrong, still the machine produced far less upward force than the tables and formulas they were working from predicted. Wilbur was shaken in a way that Orville rarely saw. On the train home from their 1901 experiments, Wilbur is said to have told a companion that he didn't believe men would fly for 50 years. The problem was too hard. The existing science was too wrong. He was facing the possibility that everything everyone thought they knew about flight, the accumulated data, the published research, the tables that Lilienthal had spent years compiling, was simply incorrect. And without reliable data, how could you build a reliable machine? His answer was to generate the data himself. Back in Dayton that autumn of 1901, the brothers built a wind tunnel. It was a wooden box, 6 feet long, 16 inches square, with a fan driven by a one-cylinder engine that pushed air through it at speeds of up to 40 miles per hour. Into this wind tunnel they placed small metal wing shapes, airfoils, hundreds of them of different sizes and curves and angles, and they measured with instruments of their own design and manufacture the lift and drag that each shape produced. They ran experiment after experiment, carefully, systematically, filling notebooks with data. It was painstaking, tedious, brilliant work. By the end of it, they had generated the most accurate and comprehensive aerodynamic data set that had yet existed in the world. And their data differed dramatically from Lilienthal's and from the standard coefficient used in all existing calculations. The standard coefficient of air pressure, which had been accepted since John Smeaton had proposed it in the 18th century, was wrong. Not slightly wrong, significantly wrong. The brothers had just corrected a fundamental error in the science of flight. They returned to Kill Devil Hills in 1902 with a new glider, redesigned from the ground up using their own wind tunnel data. The 1902 glider was a different machine entirely. It was longer, flatter, with a new fixed rear vertical tail that helped control the yawing motion. They made hundreds of glides that autumn, more than 1,000 total over the weeks they were there. They refined the design as they went, adding a movable rear rudder connected to the wing warping mechanism so that the pilot could coordinate turns smoothly, banking with the wings while using the rudder to prevent the nose from swinging out. They solved the problem that had been causing their wings to roll the wrong way, the counterintuitive drop that had frightened them in 1901. They were flying, really flying. Gliding down the slopes of Kill Devil Hills with precision and grace and control, making coordinated turns, maintaining level flight, doing things that no one had ever done in the air before. But gliding was not enough. They had solved control. They had solved lift. Now they needed power. They needed an engine. They wrote to manufacturers of automobile engines, asking if anyone could supply a lightweight power plant producing at least 8 horsepower while weighing no more than 180 pounds. The manufacturers wrote back with polite variations on the theme of impossibility. No such engine existed. The technology wasn't there. The brothers would have to build it themselves. So they did, together with Charlie Taylor, the skilled machinist they employed in their bicycle shop, and who had become an essential part of their small team. They designed and built an engine in roughly 6 weeks. It was a 4-cylinder water-cooled engine that produced 12 horsepower and weighed just 170 pounds. It was not elegant, it leaked oil, it vibrated badly, it had to be hand-started by spinning the propeller, but it worked, and it was light enough and powerful enough to matter. The propellers were, in some ways, an even more remarkable achievement. The brothers had assumed that designing a propeller would be straightforward. Surely the science of ship propellers, which had been well developed for decades, could be applied to the air. It could not. Marine propellers moved through an incompressible fluid. Air was something else entirely. There was essentially no useful science of aerial propellers. The brothers had to derive the theory from scratch. They argued about it, famously, furiously, productively, the way brothers argue when they are both very smart and very invested in being right, and in the course of arguing they thought their way through to a fundamental insight. A propeller was simply a rotating wing, generating thrust in the same way a wing generated lift, by creating a pressure difference between its two surfaces. Having understood this, they could design propellers using the same principles and the same data they had developed in their wind tunnel. Their first propellers were astonishingly efficient, converting roughly 66% of the engine's power into thrust, a figure that would not be significantly improved upon for years. They built their powered machine, which they called the Flyer, through the winter and spring of 1903. It was a biplane with a 40-foot wingspan, a canard elevator at the front for pitch control, wing warping connected to the rear rudder for roll and yaw control, and 2 counter-rotating propellers driven by the engine through bicycle chains, a detail that was both practical and faintly poetic, given where these men had come from. The pilot would lie face down on the lower wing beside the engine, his hip resting in a wooden cradle connected to the wing warping mechanism. To control the roll, he shifted his hips. To control the pitch, he moved a hand lever. To control the engine, he worked throttle and magneto switches. It was complicated enough to demand total attention and simple enough, theoretically, to manage. They arrived at Kill Devil Hills in September of 1903 and found that the 1902 glider, which they had left there in storage, had been damaged by storms. They repaired it and made some gliding flights to stay current and then set about assembling the Flyer. The work was slow. The engine had problems, a cracked magneto housing, a damaged propeller shaft. Parts had to be shipped back to Dayton for repair and replacement. The weather was brutal, cold, wet, with gales off the Atlantic that made working outdoors miserable. And there was competition. Samuel Langley, the Smithsonian secretary, had been working on his own powered flying machine with $50,000 of government backing, an enormous sum, and on October 7, 1903, he had attempted to launch his great aerodrome from a houseboat on the Potomac River. It had fallen immediately into the water. It was a public humiliation for Langley and for the project, but he had another attempt scheduled. If Langley succeeded before the Wrights, history would be written differently. The brothers worked on. In November, a propeller shaft cracked. Orville went back to Dayton himself to machine replacement shafts from harder steel. He returned in late November and they were nearly ready when the shafts cracked again, this time in a different place. They repaired them. They set up their launching rail, a 60-foot wooden track on which the Flyer would roll on a small wheeled dolly until it reached flying speed. They waited for reasonable weather. On December 14th, Wilbur won the coin toss and made the first attempt. The Flyer lifted off the rail, climbed steeply, stalled, and hit the ground about 100 feet out. A minor repair was needed. Not a crash exactly, but not a successful flight either. They sent a telegram home, no success. December 17, 1903 was a Thursday. The temperature was in the low 30s. The wind off the Atlantic was blowing at somewhere between 20 and 27 miles per hour, strong, steady, cold. Too strong, really, for an ideal test. But the brothers had been waiting long enough. They set out their signal flag, calling the men from the nearby life-saving station to come and witness. 5 men came: John Daniels, Adam Etheridge, and Will Doe from the Kill Devil Hills life-saving station, and 2 local men, W.C. Brinkley and Johnny Moore. The brothers set up John Daniels with the camera aimed at the end of the launching rail and instructed him carefully. When the machine left the rail, press this button. Daniels had never operated a camera before in his life. He would take the most famous photograph in the history of technology. It was Orville's turn. He climbed onto the lower wing, settled his hips in the control cradle, checked his controls, checked the engine. They had rigged a small anemometer to measure the wind, 27 miles per hour. Wilbur stood to the right of the wing, steadying it. The engine crackled and roared. Orville released the wire holding the flyer in place. It began to move down the rail. Wilbur ran alongside, supporting the wing, trying to keep pace. He couldn't. The flyer accelerated away from him and lifted off the end of the rail. John Daniels pressed the button. The photograph was taken. The flyer was airborne. It flew for 12 seconds. It covered 120 feet. It was in the air, under power, under control, carrying a man. When it landed, Orville had been flying. There is no record of what the brothers said to each other in that moment. The surviving accounts from the witnesses are brief and somewhat confused. The men from the life-saving station shook hands with the brothers and said some things that were later reported but not clearly remembered. The brothers themselves were practical men, not given to theatrics, and the machine needed to be reset for another attempt. They reset it. They made 3 more flights that morning, taking turns. Each one was a little longer than the last. On the 4th flight, Wilbur flew 852 feet in 59 seconds. And then, while they were discussing the flights on the ground, a gust of wind caught the flyer and tumbled it, and it was damaged badly enough that it never flew again. They sent a telegram to their father that afternoon. Success 4 FLIGHTS Thursday morning, all against 21-mile wind, started from level with engine power alone, average speed through air 31 miles, longest 57 seconds, inform press, home Christmas. The telegram operator leaked the news to a local paper, which ran a wildly inaccurate story. Most newspapers ignored it entirely or buried it in small items. The world, astonishingly, did not understand what had happened. The New York Times did not send a reporter to Kitty Hawk. The Dayton papers were politely skeptical. The scientific community largely ignored the claims. It would take years, literally years, before the world truly understood what had occurred on that cold Thursday morning on the North Carolina sand. Part of this was the brothers' own doing. They were intensely private, deeply competitive, and genuinely worried about having their invention stolen before they could patent it and secure their future. For nearly 2 years after Kitty Hawk, they barely flew at all, and when they did fly, testing a series of dramatically improved flyers at a field outside Dayton called Huffman Prairie, they did it as quietly as possible, telling almost no one, declining interviews, refusing to give demonstrations. The farmers who owned the field saw what they were doing, of course, and some of them talked, but the newspapers that ran the occasional story were met with polite non-confirmation from the brothers, and the larger world remained unconvinced. The Scientific American ran an editorial in 1906 expressing skepticism that the Wright brothers had really flown at all, given their refusal to demonstrate publicly. What they had been doing at Huffman Prairie, quietly and systematically, was transforming their invention from a demonstration of possibility into a practical flying machine. The 1903 flyer had been a proof of concept. The machines they flew in 1904 and 1905 were refinements, better controlled, more stable, capable of longer and more complex flights. By October 1905, Wilbur was making flights of more than 30 minutes, covering more than 20 miles, banking in smooth circles over the Ohio cornfields. The airplane was real. It worked. It could be turned and banked and landed and taken off again. On October 5, 1905, Wilbur flew for 38 minutes and 3 seconds, covering more than 24 miles. That flight, more than the 12 seconds at Kitty Hawk, was the true demonstration that powered, controlled flight had been solved. They filed their patent in 1906. It was a remarkable document, broad, clever, focused on the control system rather than the specific machine, protecting the core insight rather than a particular design. The patent would make them wealthy eventually, though it would also consume years of their lives in brutal legal battles against competitors and imitators. And the competitors came quickly, because by 1908 the world had finally started to believe. In the summer of that year, Wilbur went to France to demonstrate the Wright flyer to European audiences, while Orville remained in America to fulfill a contract with the United States Army. What happened in France was extraordinary. European aviation had been advancing in the years since Kitty Hawk, and several French engineers genuinely believed that they had already matched or surpassed whatever the Americans had done. Then Wilbur flew. On August 8, 1908, at a racecourse near Le Mans, he took the flyer into the air and within 90 seconds had demonstrated things that no European pilot had ever done. Smooth, banked turns, figure eights, precise control in 3 dimensions. The crowd was stunned. The French pilots who had come to be skeptical were openly weeping or shouting with amazement. Louis Blériot, who would cross the English Channel the following year, watched Wilbur fly and said simply in the understatement of the century that everything had changed. Henry Farman, another leading French aviator, said that what he had just witnessed made everything he had done before look like a child's game. The French press, which had been calling the Wright brothers bluffeurs for years bluffers, fell over itself in apology and celebration. Wilbur flew again and again in the weeks that followed, setting records, carrying passengers, demonstrating an airplane so far ahead of anything else in existence that it was almost in a different category entirely. And in America, Orville was making headlines of his own. On September 3, 1908, he flew at Fort Myer, Virginia before military observers, becoming the first person to make a public flight in the United States in what felt like an official demonstration. The flights were extraordinary, elegant, controlled, clearly the product of years of practice and refinement. And then on September 17, something went wrong. Orville was flying with a passenger, Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, when a propeller cracked and the plane crashed. Selfridge died of his injuries, the first person ever killed in a powered aircraft accident. Orville was severely injured with broken ribs, a broken leg, and back injuries that would pain him for the rest of his life. He spent weeks in the hospital. The crash was a devastating setback both physically and psychologically, but it did not stop the airplane. Nothing was going to stop the airplane. Wilbur continued flying in France through the winter of 1908 and into 1909, and the world followed him with a wonder and reverence that is almost impossible to convey today, when aircraft are so routine as to be furniture. In the early months of powered flight, when almost no one had ever seen an airplane, watching Wilbur Wright fly was one of the most extraordinary experiences a human being could have. Crowds of tens of thousands gathered at his demonstrations. Kings and presidents asked to meet him. He was, in the original sense of the word, a phenomenon, something outside the normal range of human experience, something that required you to revise your understanding of what was possible. By 1909 and 1910, aviation was everywhere. Not the Wrights' machines specifically, but the idea they had proved that humans could fly, could control their flight, could navigate the air as they navigated the water. The imitators and the independent inventors who had been working in parallel suddenly had a proof of concept to aim at, and they rushed forward with a speed that is startling in retrospect. Within 5 years of Kitty Hawk, several dozen people had built and flown their own aircraft. Within 10, there were hundreds of pilots and dozens of designs. Within 15, the airplane was being used in warfare. The world moved fast once the door was opened, and Wilbur and Orville Wright had opened the door. The brothers became wealthy from their patents and their fame, though neither of them seemed particularly interested in wealth for its own sake. They were comfortable, careful men who had always lived modestly and continued to do so. They moved into a grand house in Dayton that their father named Hawthorne Hill, but they were not grand people. They were still in their hearts, the same 2 boys from the same Dayton house who had looked at a toy helicopter spinning toward the ceiling and refused to stop asking why. Wilbur died in 1912 at the age of 45 of typhoid fever. He had been the older brother, the one who had first turned their shared fascination into organized inquiry, the one who had written the first letter to the Smithsonian, the one who had gone to France and wept the world open with wonder. He died at Hawthorne Hill, surrounded by his family, and his father wrote in his diary, "A short life full of consequences. It is the most precise epitaph in the English language." Orville lived until 1948. He lived to see the jet airplane. He lived to see the atom bomb drop from a plane. He lived to see the war that aviation had both enabled and in some ways he felt made worse, the Second World War, in which aircraft had become instruments of industrial destruction, raining fire on cities, killing hundreds of thousands of people. He was not a man who wore his complications lightly. He understood the ambiguity of what he and his brother had created. The airplane was the greatest gift of the 20th century and one of its greatest instruments of horror, and Orville carried both of those truths in his quiet, meticulous way until he died on January 30, 1948 of a heart attack in Dayton, Ohio. He was 76 years old. He had been born in a world where nothing mechanical flew. He died in a world where the sky was full of machines. The original 1903 flyer is at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., where it has hung from the ceiling of the main hall since 1976. It hangs there above visitors who crane their necks to look at it, this fragile, impossible thing, this wood and canvas and wire and a little engine leaking oil. And if you stand beneath it long enough, you start to feel something. The weight of it. The improbability of it. The distance between that thing up there and everything that came after it, all the jets and rockets and satellites and lunar landers that fill the museum around it. All of that, every bit of it, traces its genealogy back to 12 seconds over a North Carolina beach on a cold December morning in 1903. 2 bicycle mechanics from Dayton, No degrees, no government money, no famous institutional backing. Just a toy from childhood, a cardboard inner tube box, a wind tunnel built from scrap wood, and an absolute refusal to accept that the problem was impossible. They didn't come from power. They didn't come from privilege. They came from a family where curiosity was considered more important than comfort, and where the question why was never treated as rude. They came from a workshop, a bench, a set of tools, and each other. Think about what they faced. Think about the number of times they should have stopped. The crashes, the deaths of men they admired, the years of data that turned out to be wrong, the engines that cracked, the propellers that failed, the world that didn't believe them even when they had done the thing. They were ignored, dismissed, doubted, quietly mocked. They kept going. Not because they were reckless, not because they had something to prove to anyone in particular, but because they could see the answer forming in the data, in the test results, in the numbers from their wind tunnel, and in the feel of the controls beneath their hands, and they were too stubborn and too brilliant to stop before they had it.